The earth on my hands smelled of death. Under the dim moonlight, I heard a knock that changed my life forever. No one could have guessed that saving a person from the grave would lead to the destruction of an entire empire. My name is Elisa. At the age of 12, I lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of Moscow, in an old wooden house that still remembered Soviet times. Our neighborhood was forgotten by the authorities, like a stain on the city map that everyone tried to ignore. Roads riddled with potholes, old gray buildings, and the constant smell of dampness created an atmosphere of hopelessness. But I liked to walk around the neighborhood, especially near the abandoned park, where nature was gradually reclaiming its own. My grandmother, Vera Nikolaevna, worked as a cleaner in 3 different places at once. She left early in the morning and returned late in the evening with red hands and tired eyes. Despite this, she always found the strength to cook me dinner and check how I was doing with my homework. I was an excellent student at school and dreamed of becoming a doctor so that one day my grandmother could stop working. She often told me that education was the only path to a better life. We had little money, but a lot of books. Old, tattered volumes of classical literature filled our shelves. Every Sunday we went to the local library, where I borrowed new books for the week. The librarian, Anna Petrovna, always set something special aside for me. She said that in her 30 years of work, she had never seen children as eager for knowledge as I was. On the day when it all began, I was just returning from the library. It was mid-October. A cold wind drove yellow leaves through the streets, and the sky was covered with heavy gray clouds. I decided to take a shortcut through the abandoned park, even though my grandmother had forbidden me to go there alone. It was quiet in the park. Only the wind rustled in the crowns of the trees, and a dog was barking somewhere in the distance. Old swings creaked, swaying on rusty chains. I clutched the books wrapped in a plastic bag tightly to my chest to protect them from possible rain. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal, maybe a wounded bird or a stray cat. But then I realized that the sound was coming from underground. It was a muffled knock and something like a human voice. My heart began to beat faster. The sound came from that part of the park where there used to be flower beds, but now only weeds grew. I cautiously approached. The ground in one place looked disturbed, as if it had recently been dug. The knocking became louder, and now I could clearly hear the muffled voice of a person calling, "Help me." I immediately realized that someone was buried underground. My hands went cold with horror, but I knew I had to do something. Looking around, I noticed an old metal shovel leaning against a tree. Without thinking about the danger, I grabbed it and began to dig quickly. The ground was soft and gave way easily. After a few minutes of intense effort, I came across something solid. It was a wooden box, resembling a roughly hewn coffin. The knocking and cries for help came from there. My hands trembled as I brushed away the last clods of earth. Finally, the lid of the box was completely exposed. There was no lock on it, only a few nails around the edges. I used the shovel as a lever to move the lid. The wood creaked, and I saw a pale man's face, distorted by fear and suffering. He was wearing an expensive but crumpled and dirty suit. His hands and feet were tied with rope, and his mouth was taped shut. I quickly tore off the tape, and he greedily inhaled air. His eyes, red from burst blood vessels, looked at me with such relief and gratitude that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. As I untied the ropes on his hands, he said in a hoarse voice that his name was Viktor Andreevich Sokolov. He said that he had been kidnapped and buried alive by people working for his competitor. Viktor Andreevich was the owner of a large construction company, and someone really wanted him to disappear forever. I managed to free his hands, and he untied the ropes on his feet himself. Getting out of the box, he staggered and almost fell. I supported him, although he was much taller and heavier than me. His suit was soaked in sweat, and his hands were covered in scratches from trying to get out. He asked, "Do you have a phone?" I shook my head. Mobile phones were a luxury that my grandmother and I could not afford. Viktor Andreevich looked around, as if afraid that the kidnappers might return. Then he leaned towards me and whispered words that I remembered for the rest of my life. He said that I had saved not only his life, but also his soul, and that he was eternally in my debt. His words sounded sincere, and I, a girl from a poor family, felt truly significant for the first time. I cried, but not from fear or grief, but from the emotions that overwhelmed me. Together we left the park. Viktor Andreevich was weak and needed medical attention. On the street, he stopped a passing taxi and, before leaving, wrote down my address and my grandmother's name. He promised that he would return and thank me for saving him. I watched the taxi drive away, carrying away a man whose life was so strangely intertwined with mine. When I returned home, my grandmother was already cooking dinner. I smelled of earth, and my hands were dirty. I told her the whole story, expecting her to scold me for walking through the park. But my grandmother just hugged me and said that she was proud of me. She added that people like Viktor Andreevich rarely remember their promises to ordinary people. I didn't want to believe her. In my childish heart, there was confidence that the person I saved from a terrible death would definitely keep his word. That night, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. The face of Viktor Andreevich stood before my eyes when I opened the lid of his wooden prison. There was so much hope and gratitude in his eyes. I imagined him coming to our house, maybe even tomorrow, and how our life would change. Maybe my grandmother wouldn't have to work 3 jobs anymore. Maybe we would even move from our old house to an apartment with hot water that worked every day, not on a schedule. A week passed, but Viktor Andreevich did not appear. I told my best friend, Masha, who lived in the neighboring house, about what happened. She was delighted and asked every day if my millionaire had arrived yet. I was beginning to doubt that he would even remember me. My grandmother was right. Rich people live in their own world and quickly forget about people like us. But 10 days after that incident in the park, a black car with tinted windows stopped near our house. A driver in a strict suit got out and opened the back door. Viktor Andreevich looked completely different than he did at our first meeting. His skin had acquired a healthy color, his suit was impeccable, and his movements were confident. Only his eyes remained the same, attentive and a little wary. My grandmother had just returned from work, and we met the guests together. Viktor Andreevich was polite and courteous. He brought gifts with him. For me, it was the latest smartphone, which I could only dream of, and for my grandmother, a beautiful silk scarf. But most importantly, he offered my grandmother a job at his company, an administrative position with a good salary and a full benefits package. My grandmother initially refused, saying that she did not have the necessary education, but Viktor Andreevich insisted that her experience and responsibility were more important than any diplomas. Before leaving, he took me aside and said that he wanted to do something else for me. He offered to pay for my education at a prestigious private school and then at a medical institute. He knew about my dream of becoming a doctor and wanted to help me make it come true. I couldn't believe my happiness and rushed to hug him. He awkwardly patted me on the back, but I felt that he was pleased with my sincere expression of gratitude. Thus began a new chapter in our life. My grandmother quit all 3 jobs and started working in Viktor Andreevich's office. I transferred to a new school, where for the first time I felt what it meant to be an outsider. Children from wealthy families looked down on me, whispering behind my back. My clothes, bought in an ordinary store and not in a boutique, betrayed my origins, but I was determined to prove that I was worthy of this chance. I studied even harder than before, and soon my excellent grades forced my classmates to treat me with some respect. Viktor Andreevich regularly showed interest in our lives. He called my grandmother to find out how we were doing, sometimes invited us to a restaurant. For me, these were magical evenings. I had never been to such places before, where waiters in white gloves served food whose names I could not pronounce. Viktor Andreevich patiently explained to me what foie gras and truffles were, taught me how to use the numerous forks and knives. He spoke to me as an adult, was interested in my opinion about the books I read and the events in the world. I began to consider him my guardian angel, almost a second father. My real father left us when I was 3 years old, and I hardly remembered him. Viktor Andreevich filled this void in my life. I caught his every word, tried to imitate his manners, his way of speaking. He became a role model for me, the kind of successful person I wanted to be. My grandmother was more restrained in her feelings. She was grateful for the help, but still kept a little aloof. One day, when we returned from another restaurant, she told me that you shouldn't blindly trust people, even if they seem kind and generous. Every person pursues their own interests, and it is important to understand exactly what they are. I didn't pay attention to her words. It seemed to me that she just couldn't forget her former life, where she had to be constantly on her guard and trust no one. A year passed. My grandmother and I moved to a new apartment in a good neighborhood. The rent was paid by Viktor Andreevich, saying that it was part of my grandmother's compensation package. I continued to study well and even found some friends in the new school. Life seemed wonderful. It was then that I began to notice the first alarming signs. One day, I accidentally overheard my grandmother's phone conversation with someone from the office. She was speaking quietly, thinking that I couldn't hear. It was about some documents that she had been instructed to sign. The person on the other end of the line, apparently, warned her to be careful. My grandmother replied that she understood the risks, but she had no choice if she wanted to keep her job and my education. When I asked her about it in conversation, she brushed it off, saying that these were ordinary work matters. But I saw worry in her eyes. She began to stay at work more often, returning home tense and silent. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and said that she was just tired. At about the same time, Viktor Andreevich's behavior also changed. He began to call and invite us somewhere less often. When we met, he was distracted, often answered calls and talked about urgent matters. One day, I heard him discussing some major construction project in our area on the phone. It was about demolishing several old houses to build a new business center. I didn't attach any importance to this, but I remembered the name of the project, Aurora. At school, I became friends with Dasha, the daughter of a well-known journalist who specialized in investigating corruption in the construction business. Dasha was a smart and independent girl, not as superficial as most of our classmates. We often discussed books and movies with her, shared dreams about the future. I told her the story of how I saved Viktor Andreevich, and she was impressed. But when I mentioned the name of the Aurora project, she looked at me strangely. Dasha said that her father was just investigating this project. According to her, there were many violations and suspicious schemes there. Allegedly, Viktor Andreevich bribed several officials to obtain permission to build in the historical part of the city. Moreover, residents of houses subject to demolition were forced to sell their apartments at reduced prices, threatening that otherwise they would not receive anything at all. I didn't believe her. Viktor Andreevich couldn't be like that. He was a kind, generous person who helped my grandmother and me when no one else would. I decided that Dasha's father was mistaken or deliberately tarnishing Viktor Andreevich's reputation at the behest of his competitors. We quarreled and didn't talk for several days, but the seed of doubt had been sown. I began to listen more carefully to my grandmother's conversations and notice small details in Viktor Andreevich's behavior. One day, when my grandmother took a sleeping pill and slept soundly, I took her work laptop. I was ashamed of such an intrusion into her personal space, but I had to know the truth. In her email, I found correspondence with the company's legal department. It was about documents for the Aurora project. In one of the letters, the company's lawyer directly wrote that my grandmother's signature was needed on a number of documents recording allegedly held meetings with residents of houses, at which they voluntarily agreed to the proposed relocation conditions. My grandmother had to sign these protocols retroactively, although no meetings were actually held. I was shocked. It turned out that Dasha and her father were right. Viktor Andreevich used illegal methods to implement his project. But even worse, he dragged my grandmother into it, putting her in a vulnerable position. She could become an accomplice to a crime and be punished if everything came out. I spent a sleepless night thinking about what to do. In the morning, I decided to talk to my grandmother frankly. At first, she denied everything. But then, seeing my determination, she confessed. Yes, she knew that some of the documents she signed contained false information, but she really had no choice. Viktor Andreevich made it clear that if she refused to cooperate, we would not only lose our job and apartment, but there might be problems with my education at school. My grandmother said that she had tried to find another job, but at her age and without special education, it was almost impossible. and she could not allow me to return to the old school and lose the chance for a better future. I hugged her and said that we would figure something out, but inside me, anger was boiling. Viktor Andreevich betrayed my trust. He used my grandmother as a tool for his machinations, blackmailing her with my future. That same week, local news featured a story about protests by residents of houses that were planned to be demolished for the Aurora project. Among the protesters was an elderly woman, a retired teacher, who had lived in her apartment for over 40 years. With tears in her eyes, she said that representatives of Viktor Andreevich's company had threatened her and other residents. If they did not agree to the proposed compensation, they would create problems with gas, water, and electricity, turning life into hell until they themselves wanted to leave. This was the last straw that I needed. I decided to talk to Viktor Andreevich in person. I called him and asked for a meeting. He was surprised, but agreed to meet me in a cafe near my school. I came prepared with copies of letters from my grandmother's email and printouts of news articles about the Aurora project. Viktor Andreevich looked tired when he came to the meeting. He ordered me ice cream as usual and asked how things were at school. I didn't beat around the bush and put all the documents in front of him. His face changed. The smile disappeared, and his eyes became cold. He asked where I got these papers. I honestly replied that I found them on my grandmother's computer. Then Viktor Andreevich spoke to me in a completely different tone. He said that I was still a child and did not understand how the real world works. In business, you sometimes have to compromise your conscience in order to achieve greater good. The Aurora project will bring new jobs and taxes to the city, and the old houses will sooner or later be declared dilapidated anyway. He is just accelerating the inevitable process. As for my grandmother, she is an adult and made her own choice. No one forced her to sign the documents. And the story of how I saved him in the park is of course touching. But you can't be eternally in debt to a 12-year-old girl. He has already done more for us than anyone else would have. His words sounded reasonable, but I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Cold calculation. All his kindness was a mask, a way to manipulate people. He helped my grandmother and me not out of gratitude, but because he saw an opportunity to use us. My grandmother, with her impeccable reputation and lack of connections in the business community, was an ideal candidate for the role of a figurehead, and I was a lever of pressure on her. I got up from the table and said that I would tell everything to Dasha's journalist father.
Viktor Andreevich left.
He said that no one would believe the words of a schoolgirl against a respected businessman. And even if I provide documents, it will only harm my grandmother, because her signature is on them. At best, she will be fired. At worst, she could become a defendant in a criminal case, and I will end up in an orphanage because I have no other relatives. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't allow myself to cry in front of him. I silently gathered my papers and left the cafe. It started to rain outside, and I ran home, soaked to the skin, with a feeling of complete devastation and betrayal. The person I considered my savior turned out to be a monster using people as pawns in his game. At home, I told my grandmother about my conversation with Viktor Andreevich. She didn't look surprised. She said that she always felt that there was a calculation behind his generosity, but she hoped that she was wrong. We discussed our options. My grandmother could quit, but we would lose the apartment and my place at school. We could go to the police or the prosecutor's office, but without solid evidence, except for a few letters, we had no chance against an influential businessman with a team of expensive lawyers. That night, I cried into my pillow, feeling betrayed and helpless. Everything I believed in for the past year turned out to be a lie. Viktor Andreevich, my hero, the man I saved from a terrible death, turned out to be a cold-blooded manipulator. He used my kindness and naivety to draw my grandmother into his dirty business. The next few days I walked around as if in a fog. I couldn't concentrate on my lessons, avoided communicating with classmates. Dasha noticed my condition and offered to tell everything to her father, but I was afraid of the consequences for my grandmother. Viktor Andreevich made it clear that he would make her a scapegoat if the truth came out. In the evening, a new story about the Aurora project was shown on television. Now residents of houses began to receive letters with a notice of forced eviction. The story showed an elderly man with a disability who said that he had nowhere to go. The proposed compensation would not be enough even for a room on the outskirts of the city, let alone an apartment, and his disability pension barely covers medicine and food. Couldn't sleep that night. Before my eyes were the faces of people whose lives Viktor Andreevich was destroying for his own profit, and my grandmother, forced to participate in this deception under threat of losing her job. I felt anger growing inside me, pushing out the pain and disappointment. I had to do something not only for myself and my grandmother, but also for all those people whose homes were going to be taken away. In the morning, I made a decision. I couldn't allow Viktor Andreevich to continue his machinations, but I couldn't act openly so as not to endanger my grandmother. I needed a plan, a way to stop him so that he couldn't blame us. I started collecting information about the Aurora project online. I found a group of activists who were protesting against the demolition of houses. I anonymously contacted them and learned a lot about the methods that Viktor Andreevich used. It turned out that our situation with my grandmother was not unique. He hired people without connections and with a clean reputation so that they would sign dubious documents. If something went wrong, they became ideal scapegoats. I also learned that the Aurora project was not the only dubious undertaking of Viktor Andreevich. Over the past 5 years, his company has implemented several similar projects in different areas of the city, always according to the same scheme: bribery of officials, pressure on residents, falsification of documents. And every time he got away with it. But most importantly, I found out that the land under the houses that were planned to be demolished was much more valuable than it seemed at first glance. According to the general plan for the development of the city, a new metro line was to pass through this area. After its opening, the value of real estate there would increase significantly. Residents didn't know about this because the information was not publicized, but Viktor Andreevich, who had connections in the city administration, was aware of it. Simultaneously with this investigation, I was trying to find a way to protect my grandmother. I knew that she kept copies of all the documents that she signed, in case someone tried to blame her for everything. But this was not enough. I needed proof that she was acting under pressure and not on her own initiative. And then I had an idea. If we had a recording on which Viktor Andreevich admits that he forced my grandmother to sign forged documents, threatening our well-being, it could protect her. But how to get such a recording? I couldn't just approach him with a voice recorder and ask him to repeat what he told me in the cafe. My grandmother noticed my anxiety and one evening called me for a serious conversation. She said that she saw how worried I was and that I shouldn't take on adult problems. She will find a way out of the situation. Perhaps we will have to return to our old house and live more modestly. But this is not the end of the world. The main thing is that we are together and do not cross our conscience. I didn't tell her about my plans. I didn't want to worry her. But inside me, a decision had already matured. I wasn't going to back down. Viktor Andreevich had to answer for his actions, not only for what he did to us, but also for all those people whose lives he had destroyed for his own benefit. I continued to collect information and think about a plan. I was 15 years old, but I had always been mature for my age. My grandmother often said that I had an old soul, and now this soul demanded justice. I couldn't just forget everything and move on, knowing that Viktor Andreevich continues to deceive and use people. Every day after school, I spent in the library, studying everything I could find about Viktor Andreevich's company, about the Aurora project, about the laws concerning construction and resettlement. I took notes, systematized information, looked for weaknesses in his schemes, and gradually a plan began to take shape in my mind. I learned that in 3 weeks, public hearings on the Aurora project were to begin. This was a formality since all decisions had already been made, but by law, such hearings had to be held. Viktor Andreevich would probably prepare stooges who would speak in support of the project and documents confirming that the majority of residents agreed to the resettlement. But what if uncomfortable facts that he tried to hide were voiced at these hearings? I decided that this would be my moment of truth. I will speak at the hearings and tell everything that I know, but I understood that my words would not be enough. I needed evidence that was irrefutable and shocking, which could not be ignored or hushed up. And it was then, when I had almost despaired of finding such evidence, that fate presented me with an unexpected gift. My grandmother came home in tears. Viktor Andreevich called her in and ordered her to sign a new batch of documents, even more dubious than the previous ones. It was about forged results of an environmental expertise, which allegedly showed that old houses were dangerous for residents due to mold and fungus. My grandmother refused, and he threatened not only to fire her, but also to ensure that she could not find a job anywhere else, and to kick me out of school with such a characterization that no decent educational institution would accept me. My grandmother was desperate. She said that she didn't know what to do. Signing these documents meant becoming an accomplice to even greater deception, but refusing meant jeopardizing my future. I hugged her and said that I had a plan. I just needed her to trust me and do what I asked her to do. I told her my idea. My grandmother had to agree to sign the documents, but ask for a day to think it over, and the next day go to Viktor Andreevich with a voice recorder in her pocket and try to make him repeat his threats. My grandmother hesitated. She was afraid that he would suspect something, but I convinced her that this was our only chance to protect ourselves and help other victims of his machinations. The next day, my grandmother returned from work with a victorious smile. She had done it. She recorded the entire conversation with Viktor Andreevich, where he openly spoke about falsifying documents and threatened her with consequences if she refused. This was exactly the evidence I needed, but I knew that one recording wasn't enough. I needed more to completely collapse his empire. From that moment on, my plan for revenge began to take concrete shape. I had a recording of Viktor Andreevich's conversation with my grandmother, but I knew that was just the beginning. I needed to gather more evidence of his corrupt activities, find allies, and think through every step so that he couldn't wriggle out of it and avoid responsibility. First, I turned to Dasha. I told her the whole story from beginning to end, including how I saved Viktor Andreevich in the park, how he helped my grandmother and me, and then how he began blackmailing her, forcing her to sign forged documents. Dasha was shocked. She said that this was exactly the information her father was looking for his investigation. But I asked her not to tell him yet. I wanted to gather all the evidence first and prepare a plan of action. Dasha offered her help. Her father, though he didn't know about our plans, often discussed his investigations at home, and she could share useful information. That's how I learned that Viktor Andreevich had connections not only in the city administration but also in law enforcement agencies. That's why previous attempts to bring him to justice had failed. Complaints were lost, evidence disappeared, and witnesses recanted their testimonies. I needed the help of someone who knew the inner workings of Viktor Andreevich's company well, and I remembered Marina Sergeyevna, the secretary who had worked there for many years. She was always kind to me when I came to the office to see my grandmother. Once, she even showed me how to use the office equipment and allowed me to make copies for a school project. I decided to take a chance and talk to her. After school, I came to the office, waited until most of the employees left, and approached her desk. Marina Sergeyevna was surprised to see me so late, but offered me tea and cookies as usual. I decided to speak directly. I told her that my grandmother was being forced to sign forged documents and asked if she knew anything about it. Marina Sergeyevna was silent for a long time and then sighed heavily. She said that she had worked at the company for 15 years and had seen many things that she would rather forget. Viktor Andreevich always found vulnerable people and used them, and then threw them away when they were no longer needed. She stayed only because it was difficult to find another job at her age, and she needed to raise her daughter's son. I asked if she was ready to help me gather evidence against Viktor Andreevich. She was frightened and said she couldn't risk her job. But when I told her about the residents of the houses who were being evicted, about how Viktor Andreevich had threatened my grandmother and me, she softened. She said she would think about it and let me know in a couple of days. Marina Sergeyevna kept her word. 3 days later, she called my grandmother and asked her to tell me that she agreed to help. She couldn't openly provide me with documents from the office. It would be too risky, but she could suggest where to look and what to pay attention to. She also warned that Viktor Andreevich kept the most important documents in a safe in his office, and only he and his deputy had access to it. This was important information, but not enough. I needed to find a way to access these documents. And then I remembered Maxim, the son of Viktor Andreevich's deputy. He was in the same grade as me and had a reputation as a computer genius. He often helped teachers with technical problems and even created the school website. But most importantly, he was known for his rebellious character and cool relationship with his father. I decided to befriend him. It wasn't easy, as we had hardly communicated before. But I was lucky. We were assigned a joint computer science project. Working on it, I gradually got to know Maxim better. He was indeed smart and talented, but he felt that his father never appreciated his hobbies, considering computers a waste of time. He wanted his son to follow in his footsteps in business. After several weeks, when I felt I could trust Maxim, I told him part of the truth. I didn't mention my plans altogether, but said that I knew about his father's and Viktor Andreevich's machinations with the Aurora project. I expected him to defend his father, but instead, Maxim said that he himself had accidentally learned about it by hacking into his father's computer. He was outraged that his father was involved in deceiving people, but he didn't know what to do about it. I offered him help in gathering evidence that could be handed over to law enforcement agencies or the press. Maxim hesitated. It was one thing to know about his father's dishonest deeds and quite another to actively participate in his exposure. But when I told him the stories of specific people whose lives had been destroyed because of the Aurora project, he agreed to help. Maxim became my most valuable ally. With his computer skills, we were able to access the company's internal network. He installed a spy program on his father's computer, which allowed us to see all the documents that he opened or created. That's how we learned about Viktor Andreevich's upcoming meeting with a high-ranking official from the city administration, where he planned to hand over a large sum of money for the final approval of the Aurora project. This information was a bombshell, but we needed proof of the transfer of money itself. We couldn't just announce an impending bribe without confirmation, and that's where Marina Sergeyevna came to the rescue. She said that the meeting would take place in the Belaya Lebed restaurant, in a private room. She knew about it because she herself booked the table and ordered flowers for decoration. We needed to somehow record this meeting. But how could teenagers get into an expensive restaurant and install a recording device there? It seemed impossible. And then Dasha offered an unexpected solution. Her older sister worked for a catering company that sometimes served events at the Belaya Lebed. If she could get a job as a waitress on the day of the meeting, she could bring a hidden camera with her. The plan was risky, but we had no other options. Dasha's sister, Aliona, initially refused, but when she learned that it was about exposing corruption, she agreed to help. She was a student at the Faculty of Journalism and dreamed of a career as an investigator. This was her chance to participate in a real journalistic investigation. We prepared Aliona thoroughly. Maxim set up a miniature camera disguised as a brooch, which she was supposed to attach to the waitress's uniform. The camera was activated by pressing it and could record up to 2 hours of video. Aliona had to find a way to look into the private room where the meeting would take place and turn on the recording at the right moment. The day of the meeting arrived. We were all on edge. I couldn't concentrate on my lessons, constantly checking my phone, waiting for a message from Aliona. Finally, in the evening, she wrote that everything had worked out. She managed to record the moment of the money transfer and part of the conversation in which Viktor Andreevich and the official discussed how to circumvent the requirements of the environmental impact assessment for the Aurora project. It was a breakthrough. We finally had irrefutable proof of corruption. But we understood that one episode with a bribe might not be enough to completely stop Viktor Andreevich. He had connections, money, and influence. He could get away with a fine or a suspended sentence and continue his machinations. We needed more evidence to create a complete picture of his criminal activities over many years. And then Marina Sergeyevna offered an unexpected solution. She said that the former lawyer of the company, who was fired several years ago, kept copies of all the questionable documents as his insurance in case Viktor Andreevich decided to make him a scapegoat. She knew where to find him. The former lawyer, Pavel Nikolaevich, now lived in the suburbs and ran a small legal practice. He agreed to meet with Dasha and me, but he was very cautious. He questioned us for a long time. Why do we need this information and who is behind us? When we told him the whole story, he softened. He said that he had been waiting for a long time for the moment when he could take revenge on Viktor Andreevich for his dismissal and for the way he treated people. Pavel Nikolaevich provided us with an entire folder of documents confirming the illegal methods of Viktor Andreevich's company over the past 5 years. There were forged expert reports, documents on bribing officials, tax evasion schemes, a real treasure trove for a journalistic investigation. Now we had enough material to completely destroy Viktor Andreevich's reputation and business. But we had to act very carefully. If he found out about our investigation before we published all the evidence, he could take measures to stop us and destroy the evidence. We decided that the best moment to strike would be the public hearings on the Aurora project, which were scheduled to take place in a week. The press, representatives of the city administration, and activists would be present. It would be the perfect stage for exposure. But we couldn't just go out and present all the evidence ourselves. We needed someone adult whose voice would carry weight. And then Dasha suggested contacting her father. He was a respected journalist with a reputation as an incorruptible fighter for justice. If he presented our evidence at the hearings, it couldn't be ignored. We met with him and showed him everything we had gathered. The video recording of the bribe transfer, documents from the former lawyer, a recording of Viktor Andreevich's threats to my grandmother. Dasha's father was impressed by the amount and quality of the collected evidence. He said that in his 20 years as a journalist, he had rarely seen such a thorough investigation and agreed to help us. Now that we had a plan and all the necessary evidence, all that remained was to wait for the day of the hearings. It was the most nerve-wracking week of my life. I was afraid that Viktor Andreevich would somehow find out about our plans, that something would go wrong, that our evidence would not be sufficient. But deep down, I knew that we were on the right track. Justice had to prevail. The day of the public hearings finally arrived. They were held in a large hall of the city administration. I arrived early, together with my grandmother, Dasha, and her father. The hall gradually filled with people. There were residents of the houses to be demolished, activists with posters, journalists, representatives of the city administration, and of course Viktor Andreevich with his team. He looked confident and calm, often smiling and shaking hands with important people. He even nodded to my grandmother and me when he noticed us in the hall, as if everything was in order and we were on his side. The hearings began with a presentation of the Aurora project. A representative of Viktor Andreevich's company spoke about the advantages of the new business center, the jobs it would create, and the taxes that would go to the city budget. He showed beautiful pictures of modern buildings made of glass and concrete that were supposed to replace the old houses. Everything looked very smooth and convincing. Then the floor was given to the residents of the houses. An elderly teacher, the same one I saw on the news, told how company representatives threatened her and other residents, how they tried to force them to agree to unfair compensation terms. But her speech was met with skepticism by many. One of the officials even noted that elderly people often exaggerate and misunderstand the situation. Next, Viktor Andreevich spoke. He spoke smoothly and convincingly. He said that he understood the residents' concerns, but the old houses were indeed in disrepair and living in them was dangerous. He even had the results of an expert examination confirming this, the same forged documents that he forced my grandmother to sign. He promised that the company would do everything possible to make the relocation process as comfortable as possible for all residents. Then it was time for questions from the audience, and that's when Dasha's father stood up. He introduced himself as a journalist conducting an independent investigation into the Aurora project and said that he had information that might be of interest to everyone present. Viktor Andreevich tensed up but maintained a calm expression on his face. Dasha's father began with documents provided by the former lawyer of the company. He spoke in detail about the schemes for bribing officials, the falsification of expert reports, and the pressure on residents. He showed documents on a large screen so everyone could see the signatures and seals. Tension was building in the hall. Journalists were feverishly taking notes. Residents of the houses were indignantly talking, and representatives of the administration looked increasingly concerned. Viktor Andreevich tried to stop the speech, stating that it was slander and provocation. He said that the documents could be forged and that the former lawyer had personal scores to settle with the company. But Dasha's father was ready for such a reaction. He moved on to the next part of the exposé, a video recording of the bribe being given to a high-ranking official. When the video appeared on the screen, Silence reigned in the hall. Everyone clearly saw Viktor Andreevich handing an envelope to the official and discussing with him how to circumvent the requirements of the environmental impact assessment. The official, who, by the way, was present in the hall, turned pale and began to hastily collect his things, clearly intending to leave the hearing. But the strongest blow awaited Viktor Andreevich ahead. Dasha's father turned on the recording of his conversation with my grandmother, where he openly threatened her and forced her to sign forged documents. Outcries of indignation were heard in the hall. Many residents recognized in the described situation what was happening to them. Viktor Andreevich looked confused. He tried to say something, explain, but he was interrupted by indignant shouts from the hall. I saw him looking for his lawyers, but they seemed to be equally stunned by the scale of the revelations. At that moment, I felt that I had to speak myself. I raised my hand, and the chairman, perhaps out of a desire to somehow defuse the situation, gave me the floor. I went to the microphone, feeling my heart pounding, but my voice was firm when I began to speak. I told my story from the very beginning, how I found Viktor Andreevich buried in the park and saved him, how he promised to thank me and my grandmother, and how he initially fulfilled his promises, and then how he began to use us, blackmailing my grandmother, forcing her to participate in his machinations. I spoke about how he betrayed my trust and kindness, how cynically he used my naivety and my grandmother's vulnerability. The hall listened to me in complete silence. I saw the emotions on people's faces changing. Surprise, sympathy, anger. And Viktor Andreevich sat with his head down, not daring to look me in the eye. At that moment, I realized that I had won. Not only did I expose his machinations, but I also showed everyone his true face, the face of a person ready to use and betray even a child who saved his life. When I finished my speech, applause rang out in the hall. People rose from their seats, expressing support. The chairman announced a break in the hearings, but it was clear that the Aurora project in its current form no longer had a chance of being implemented. In the hall, journalists approached us wanting to take an interview. Dasha's father answered their questions, and I stood next to my grandmother, holding her hand. Suddenly, Viktor Andreevich approached us. He looked older and broken. He tried to say something, maybe apologize or explain, but I shook my head. Words no longer mattered. His betrayal could not be corrected by apologies. After the hearings, events developed rapidly. Dasha's father published a large journalistic investigation based on the materials we had collected. The article caused a huge resonance. Other media outlets picked up the topic and began their own investigations. Soon, law enforcement agencies could no longer ignore the situation and began an official investigation into the activities of Viktor Andreevich's company. Officials involved in corruption resigned one after another, trying to distance themselves from the scandal. Viktor Andreevich's company shares collapsed. Investors massively refused to cooperate, and banks froze credit lines. Viktor Andreevich tried to save the situation, gave press conferences, hired expensive public relations specialists, but it was too late. His reputation was irretrievably destroyed. A month after the hearings, Viktor Andreevich was formally charged with corruption, fraud, and document forgery. He was taken into custody, as the investigation feared that he might try to flee abroad. From a once powerful businessman, he turned into an accused awaiting trial. The residents of the houses that were planned to be demolished celebrated the victory. The Aurora project was officially canceled. Moreover, the city administration, under pressure from the public, decided to renovate these houses, preserving their historical value, but updating communications and strengthening structures. My grandmother and I also felt the consequences of our exposure. Of course, my grandmother lost her job, as Viktor Andreevich's company had effectively ceased to exist, but in return, she received an offer from a public organization protecting the rights of residents in urban development projects. Her experience and knowledge of the internal workings of construction companies proved invaluable to them. As for me, I had to leave the prestigious school, as we could no longer afford to pay for tuition, but it wasn't a big loss. I returned to my old school, where I was greeted as a heroine. The story of how I exposed the corruption scheme spread throughout the district. Teachers were proud of me, and classmates looked at me with respect. And one day, I received a letter from the Faculty of Law of one of the best universities in the country. They offered me, when the time came, to enroll in their program on the basis of a special scholarship for gifted children from low-income families. They wrote that people like me, with a keen sense of justice and a willingness to fight for the truth, were very needed in the legal system. It was unexpected and very honorable. I had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, but after everything that happened, I realized that jurisprudence attracted me no less. The opportunity to protect the rights of people, to fight against injustice and corruption, now seemed to me as noble a cause as saving lives. The trial of Viktor Andreevich took place in 6 months. He received a significant prison sentence and a large fine. All of his assets were seized, and the company was declared bankrupt. The man who once had everything now lost everything because of his greed and willingness to walk over people's heads. At the trial, I had to testify. I again told my story about how I saved Viktor Andreevich in the park, how he promised to thank me, and how he later betrayed my trust. When I spoke, Viktor Andreevich did not dare to look at me. He sat hunched over, with the face of a person who had lost not only his wealth and freedom but also his self-respect. After the hearing, when he was being led out of the hall, he stopped for a second next to me and whispered just 2 words, "Forgive me," but it was too late. Some actions cannot be forgiven. You can only accept them as a lesson and move on. 5 years have passed since those events. I enrolled in the Faculty of Law as planned. I am studying excellently and have already started working in a student legal aid clinic, where we provide free assistance to people in difficult situations. Many of them remind me of the residents of those houses that Viktor Andreevich wanted to demolish. Ordinary people who do not know their rights and do not have the resources to protect themselves from the powers that be. My grandmother still works for a public organization. Despite her age, she is full of energy and enthusiasm. Her experience and wisdom have helped many people defend their rights. We still live in our small apartment in a good neighborhood, but now it's our own apartment. We were able to buy it thanks to the compensation that the court awarded us for the moral damage caused by the actions of Viktor Andreevich. Dasha also entered the university at the Faculty of Journalism. She dreams of following in her father's footsteps and engaging in investigative journalism. We often see each other, discuss new projects in which we can collaborate. Legal expertise and journalistic investigation often go hand in hand. Maxim, the same computer genius who helped us gain access to the company's internal network, now works in the field of cybersecurity. He advises companies on information security issues. Sometimes Maxim and I work together on projects where his technical skills and my legal knowledge are needed. And what about Viktor Andreevich? He is still serving his sentence. Sometimes I see news about him. In prison, he began to write a book about his life, about how the pursuit of money and power led to his downfall. They say he sincerely repents and is trying to somehow atone for his guilt by helping other prisoners with legal issues. I do not feel hatred for him, although I cannot say that I have completely forgiven him. He taught me an important lesson. Not everything that glitters is gold, and gratitude is not always sincere. But I also realized that one person, even a very young one, can change the situation if he has determination and the support of true friends. My grandmother's and my life will never be the same. We went through betrayal and struggle, but we came out of this test stronger. I am no longer the naive 12-year-old girl who saved a millionaire buried in the park. I have grown up, become wiser, and learned to distinguish true kindness from fake. Sometimes I come to the very park where it all began. It has also changed. After the scandal with the Aurora project, the city authorities, seeking to restore their reputation, invested money in its reconstruction. Now there are new paths, benches, playgrounds. People come here to relax, walk with children, read books in the fresh air. I sit on a bench not far from the place where I once dug up Viktor Andreevich and think about the strange twists of fate. Who would have thought that saving a person from death would lead to such dramatic events? But I don't regret anything. If I had to relive the story, I would still save him because at that moment it was the right thing to do. And everything that happened later was the result of his choices, not mine. Life goes on. I look at the playing children, at the old women basking in the sun, at the young couples strolling along the paths, and I feel peace. Justice has triumphed, not immediately, not easily, but still, and I played my part in it. A little girl who saved a millionaire and then destroyed his empire, built on lies and the suffering of others. Time heals wounds, people say, and it's true. The pain from Viktor Andreevich's betrayal is not as sharp as it used to be. It has become a part of me, a part of my story, which has made me who I am today, a person who knows the value of justice and is ready to fight for it, no matter what. I get up from the bench and slowly go home, where my grandmother is waiting for me with tea and pies. We will talk about my studies, about her work, about the new books that we have read. Ordinary conversations of ordinary people whose lives were once turned upside down, but who found the strength to stand firm and move on. And in this, probably, lies the real victory. Not in destroying someone else's empire, but in building your own life on the foundation of honesty, courage, and justice.